welcome to History Club for this month. You know that I'm Mr. Jordan, and this month our special guest is our Youth Services Librarian, Sarah Wall.
I'm really excited to be here this month to talk about influential women writers. This was a topic that I was really excited to be a part of because I studied creative writing when I was a college student and was really interested in the history of creative writing, especially focusing on women authors who are often overlooked. Of course, there are thousands of amazing women authors out there, and we could only touch on a few of them in this presentation. So I just tried to pick a few that were very influential in either creating or influencing a major genre so that you can get a taste of a bunch of different women authors.
So the first writer we're going to talk about today is Murasaki Shikibu. So we don't know a lot about her as far as her actual life goes. We don't even know if this is her real name or a pen name that she used. We do, however, know that she was born in Kyoto, Japan, which was the capital of Japan at that time during the Japanese feudal period. So it'd be in medieval times. And at that time there were a lot of different families who were very powerful and influential in Japan, and one of them was the Fujiwara family, which she was from. We know that she was very well educated because in addition to knowing Japanese, she knew Chinese as well. And we know that she married at a young age and was widowed not long afterwards. After she was a widow, she became the lady-in-waiting to the Japanese empress. And she wrote the Tale of Genji. And she started writing this probably sometime between 1001 and 1005, which is the time frame between when she became a widow and when she became lady-in-waiting. And we don't know exactly when she finished it, but we know how important it is because it's the world's first full-length novel. And it's considered one of the greatest novels in Japanese literature to this day.
Yeah, like Jordan said, Marasaki Shikibu is obviously a very influential writer because she is credited with writing the first full-length novel, which is a tradition that we have carried on. She was likely inspired by the format of telling a tale, but she made it her own by turning it into a novel and pulling from other influences. This novel focuses on the lives of the women at court and is definitely considered something worth reading to this day. And I'm going to read you a quick quote from her work, Tale of Genji. "The world know it not, but you, autumn, I confess it. Your wind at nightfall stabs deep into my heart."
So the next writer we're going to talk about is the famous novelist Jane Austen. And Jane Austen came from England, specifically an upper middle class background, which her work reflects. Her dad was a member of the clergy at the time, and her novels are focused on courtship as well as everyday life. She's one of the first writers to focus on more everyday sort of things. So you see a list of her novels here. There's many very famous ones like Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. And in spite of focusing her novels on courtship, she herself never married. And also, some of her novels were published anonymously at first, and she only took credit for them later on.
Yeah, so Jane Austen was a really influential author because, as Jordan mentioned, she was one of the first to focus on everyday life, and this has been a big influence on literature and has inspired modern genres such as women's fiction. In addition, she is known for her perspective, so instead of taking a sort of omniscient narration style, Jane Austen really focused in on the inner thoughts of her characters, which paved the way for future books to be written in first-person point of view, which is a style that many authors use in novels today. And here is a quote from Pride and Prejudice. "But people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever."
Our next writer is Mary Shelley, and she's a very famous writer, but she was not the only famous person in her family. Her dad was William Godwin, who was the philosopher who is accredited with modern anarchy. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who you see here, that's who she was named after. She was one of the very first feminists and was the leading feminist of her time. Her husband was Percy Shelley, who was another famous writer, and he focused more on poetry rather than novel. He was one of the great romantic poets in Britain at the time, along with Lord Byron. And actually, while Mary Shelley and her husband Percy were visiting Lake Geneva with Lord Byron, that particular summer, even though it was summer, was very cold due to the volcano named Mount Tambora erupting and causing chaos with the Earth's atmosphere. So instead of going outside, they had a ghost story contest inside, and the result for Mary Shelley was the story of Frankenstein, which she would go on to publish in 1818. Now, you probably all know the story of Frankenstein, and it is the world's first science fiction novel. She went on to write more novels, like Valperga, The Last Man, and Lador, so she wasn't just a one-hit wonder. Would you like to add anything about Mary Shelley?
Yeah, so like Mr. Jordan mentioned, she was the first science fiction writer. She is credited with inventing that genre. And in addition, we can see a lot of political influences in her work. Like her mother before her, she was a feminist and called for a more cooperative approach to politics than the sort of individualistic approach that many people of her time, including her husband, were promoting, and that's definitely a theme that you can see in reading her work. And this is a quote from Frankenstein. "I do know that for the sympathy of one living being, I would make peace with it all. I have love in me the likes of which you can scarcely imagine, and rage the likes of which you would not believe."
So next up, we're going to talk about Emily Dickinson, who is arguably America's greatest poet. So she was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, and like Jane Austen before her, she never married, but she took it up a notch because she was a complete recluse. She normally only interacted with her close personal family members. So, like many of the leading New England intellectuals of the time, she was inspired and influenced by the transcendentalist philosophical movement, led by intellectuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson. She was contemporary of another great American poet, Walt Whitman, who wrote "Oh Captain, My Captain" about Abraham Lincoln and things like that. And she was at her most productive, it's believed, during the American Civil War. So her poems really capture the pessimism that was going on in American society at that time and the alienation felt by American intellectuals at that period. She is credited with writing over 1,700 poems, but only 11 were published during her lifetime, and it's believed that those poems were published without her consent, that she had never wanted any of her poems to be published. And so all of her greatest, most known work was published posthumously.
So Emily Dickinson is really known as an innovative poet because she used a really unique style. Some of the features of her poems that were uncommon for the time included not titling them. Most of her poems were not titled. They often had short lines compared to longer lines of more traditional poems. She used slant rhymes, so rhymes that are close to rhyming but not quite. and she used unconventional capitalization and punctuation in her poems. Something that I think is really interesting about her poetry is that many of her poems were actually dedicated to her childhood friend and then later on her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, but these dedications were erased before they were originally published posthumously. And due to the letters that she wrote to Susan, many historians believe that she was likely in love with Susan. And here is a quote from one of her most famous poems. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all."
So our next writer is Maya Angelou, who, like Emily Dickinson, was known for her poetry, but she also wrote autobiography. Those are the two main genres she's associated with. And as far as her background information, she was born Marguerite Johnson in St. Louis, but grew up in Stamps, Arkansas. And she adopted the name Maya Angelou in 1953. In her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is considered one of the great American autobiographies. That's a picture of her from around the time that it was published. And in addition to being a writer, she was also a performer and director. She acted and had a role in the TV series Roots, and you can see her there on Sesame Street. And this is her directing a movie which I believe was called Down in the Delta. So, do you have anything to add for Maya Angelou?
Yes, I wanted to highlight Maya Angelou, especially her memoirs, because she is considered someone who is very innovative in the genre of memoirs, both in terms of the form. So, as mentioned, she was a poet, and you can really see that even in her memoirs, that she is a poet, and that was influential on her writing style, but also because she was able to do something that not many African American women were able to do at that time, which was highlight what was happening in her personal life in a public way. And because of that, her memoirs really focus on the themes of race and racism, and she was a big civil rights activist, and that's definitely something that you can see in reading her works, which are studied in many English classes. And let me share a quote from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. "The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom."
Our next famous writer is Isabel Allende. And Isabel Allende was born in Chile, where her cousin Salvador was the leader for a time, but he was deposed in a military coup led by Augusto Pinochet, which, if you'd like to know more about Augusto Pinochet, you can check out our video, Hispanic Leaders. And after the military coup, Isabel fled to Venezuela, where she began being active in journalism. And that was her original writing, but she did switch to novels after a while, and she wrote The House of Spirits in 1982, right before coming to the U.S. And after coming to the U.S., she wrote Of Love and Shadows the next year in 1984. Another famous work by her is Eva Luna, which was published in 1989, and that's among many other works, including novels, but also short story collections and young adult books. She has become so accomplished that she was awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom.
So Isabel Allende is best known for her works of magical realism, and I wanted to talk about her because she is one of the most influential authors to use this genre. If you're not familiar with the genre of magical realism, it is a genre that is set in an everyday setting, but has magical elements, and it is often said to blur the lines between fantasy and reality. And in Allende's works, she often pulls from personal experiences and historical events, as well as paying homage to the lives of women. And here is a quote from The House of Spirits, which is one of her most influential works. At times I feel as I have lived all this before, and that I have already written these very words, but I know it was not I. It was another woman who kept her notebooks so that one day I could use them. I write, and she wrote, that memory is fragile, and the space of a single life is brief.
Next up, we're going to talk about Octavia Butler, who was born in Pasadena, California. And growing up, she had trouble fitting in with some of her peers because she was very shy, and also she was very tall, and she had a learning disability. She was dyslexic. However, she didn't let that stop her from going after her goals. She was always very studious, and she knew from a very young age, in fact the age of 10, that she wanted to be a writer. So she studied at many different colleges and universities, and one of the people she studied with was the writer Harlan Ellison. Eventually she did start putting out her own books. One of the first really notable ones was Pattern Master, which you can see a copy of here, in 1976. And that started the Patternist series of books. And other series she put out were the Xenogenesis series and the Parable series. Also, she's written other novels such as Kindred, which was put out in 1979, and Fledgling in 2005. And she was the first science fiction writer to receive a Genius Grant.
I wanted to highlight Octavia Butler because even though we talked about earlier in this presentation that science fiction was created by Mary Shelley, a woman, at this time when Octavia Butler began writing, she was frustrated with the science fiction genre because she felt that it was not doing a good job of capturing women and was often being published by white men who she felt were not capturing the realistic depictions of race and class struggles in their science fiction. And so that is what she took on in her science fiction writing. She is said to have written herself into the books by having most of her novels be led by black women protagonists and having them have those influences of race and class struggles be a major part of the plot of these novels. And by doing this, she really opened up the genre of science fiction to be a more inclusive genre and invite more authors of color and more women authors into this genre, and more readers as well. She's also known as being, by some, the mother of Afrofuturism, and Afrofuturism is a genre that uses sci-fi and fantasy elements and discusses a version of Africa or the African diaspora as technologically advanced and often presenting a very thriving and hopeful future. One really famous example of this that you're probably familiar with is the movie Black Panther. That's considered to be an Afrofuturistic movie. And here is a quote of her from The Parable of the Sower. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change.
So for our last author, but certainly not the last one you should check out, is E Hinton. So if you're wondering what the SE stands for, it stands for Susan Eloise. And she was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She started writing at a very young age, and she actually wrote the book. She first became famous for The Outsiders at the age of 16. And she is known for writing many, many novels aimed at teen and young adult audiences. She's also written children's books, so she has branched out from there. and there's famous movies made out of her novels, so very accomplished. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yes, so E Hinton is often credited as being the inventor of young adult or teen fiction. So if you enjoy reading or have enjoyed in the past reading any YA novels, you can thank S.E. Hinton for her contributions to the genre. So The Outsiders is often considered the first young adult novel, and this book focuses on two rival gangs and the socio-economic impacts that society has on them. And this novel, despite its importance, is often challenged or banned in libraries. It's one of the 100 most challenged or banned books because of its honest discussions of drugs and violence. And this is a quote from The Outsiders. "It seemed funny to me that the sunset she saw from her patio and the one I saw from the back steps was the same one. Maybe the two worlds we lived in weren't so different. We saw the same sunset."
Here are our citations for the pictures. And that's it for this month. Please join us next month where we will explore the history of engineering. Until then, goodbye.